beetles, flies, and aquatic insects. And different bat species sometimes specialize in different kinds of insects. So there's some bats that really like moths, and there's some bats that really like beetles. And one bat can actually eat their entire body weight in insects in a night. So if you were to try to eat like a bat, for me as a full-grown adult human, I would have to actually eat something like 50 large pizzas or 500 quarter-pound hamburgers in order to eat like a bat eats. So while I'm willing to try to do that, it's probably not very likely I'm going to be able to do that. So what else makes bats special? Well, they're the only flying mammal. And if you look at this picture of the bat skeleton, you can actually see that the bat's wings are pretty much exactly like the bones in our hands. And their skeleton, in fact, is almost identical to ours with a little bit of different sizes and shapes of things, but they have all the same bones that we do. So if you were to stretch your arms out and grow your fingers down to the floor, basically, that's the same kind of structure that the bat's wings have. And also, bats use echolocation to navigate, communicate, and to hunt. And like I said before, they're the primary predator of night-flying insects. So bats actually do have really good eyesight. That's a myth that bats can't see very well. But if you can imagine being out at night all the time, chasing little tiny flying insects that are moving really quickly, you have to develop another way to be able to find those insects and also to navigate, because when the moon's not out, you can't really see. So bats use sound to navigate. They echolocate to find their prey, and also to avoid trees and lampposts and anything that might be in their way when they're flying. And it's pretty cool. There are a couple other echolocating mammals. You may have heard about whales and dolphins that use echolocation as well. Bats are really important to science. We study them, not only for biology and natural resources, but the military also studies bats to learn more about flight and navigation. Bats are really cool because their wings are independent of each other, whereas birds, if you watch birds fly, their wings are always flapping together. Bats can actually move their wings individually, and they can change the shape of their wings depending on what they're trying to do. So they're so agile and they're so fun to watch. I'm sure you guys maybe have seen them at night in your neighborhoods, and that's one of my favorite things to do, is just watch them chasing insects, because they're just such amazing at flying. We also study bats for medicine. I mentioned before those vampire bats. You can see here in this picture that vampire bat has snuck up on a sleeping pig and is doing, like I said, made a little incision and is lapping that blood up. They actually have an anticoagulant in their saliva that helps keep the blood flowing. And so while they're licking, it's making the blood flow. And doctors have actually developed medication for stroke victims using that anticoagulant in vampire bat blood. So I'm going to talk specifically about bats here in the U.S. now. We have about 47 species of bats. Most of them are insectivorous. They're about 90% of our bat species here in the U.S. Eat insects, and we do have a few other bats. We have some fruit, nectar, and pollen-eating bats. So you can see the bat on the left, another one of my favorites. This is a spotted bat. They are just super cute with those big giant pink ears and black and white polka dot fur. And then on the right there, we have the lesser long-nosed bat, which is a pollinating bat, and they live in the American Southwest. They pollinate cactus flowers, and they're pretty neat bats too. They have a really long tongue. Talk a little bit about how bats survive the winter. We've got two kinds of bats, basically, hibernating and migratory bats. So I'll talk first about the hibernating bats. They usually hibernate in caves and mines, and this is particularly in the northern parts of the U.S. where it gets cold in the winter and there would be no bugs available for them to eat. So they hibernate in caves and mines, which we call hibernacula. While they're in hibernation, they slow down their body functions, their breathing, their heart rate, their temperature, and that way they're able to conserve their fat to live through the winter. And during that time, they also likely reduce their immune system function a little bit, and that'll become important in a few minutes when I talk about one of the threats to our bats here in the U.S. Our migratory bats, some bats migrate short distances between their summer roosts and their winter hibernacula. So some of our hibernating bats also do migrate. And then we do have some bat species that actually migrate long distances, so they move to where there's food available in the winter. And some bats actually migrate and then hibernate in a more temperate part of their range. So they're not moving long distance across the landscape to find food and stay active all winter. They're just moving somewhere a little warmer where they can hibernate in more comfortable temperatures. So we'll talk a little bit here about some of the biggest threats to bats. If you guessed that humans are a big threat to bats, you'd be right. World population is at about 7 billion people, which is a lot of people. That means we require a lot of space, a lot of resources, a lot of energy, and all these things impact our natural resources and our wildlife. So some of the ways that we're impacting bats are things like land conversion. We're turning land from forested areas into agriculture, cave modification, not as much probably now as earlier in the 1900s when they were making a lot of show caves and places for people to go visit as tourists. And we were changing the caves and didn't realize that we were impacting the bats. Catastrophic loss of natural roosts, so things like hurricanes and big storms actually do knock down important bat roosts. Of course, our warming world, the changing climate is likely to produce higher intensity storms, so we could expect that we may see more of that. And then old building collapse and demolition. We've replaced a lot of their natural habitat with habitat that's maybe marginal. It's not necessarily exactly what they want, but they have to go somewhere. So there are a few bat species that have adapted pretty well to humans. In particular, little brown and big brown bats will live in attics and barns and things like that. So when we've removed their natural habitat and then we go ahead and remove their, the habitat that we've provided with these buildings, we're really putting the bats at a disadvantage. Pesticides are a problem. Bats drink standing surface water, so they actually will swoop down and scoop up little mouthfuls of water from ponds and pools and things like that. So anywhere, especially near agricultural lands where pesticides are concentrated in freshwater sources, the bats are picking up a lot of pesticides, and also from the insects that they're eating. Industrial air and water pollution are also affecting our bats. Same thing, you can see on the picture on the left, you see that sort of orange water. Excuse me. That's some acid mine drainage coming out of a mine, and you can tell going right into that stream. So that's affecting that fresh water. And people maybe don't always connect bats with water, but they have to drink water just like humans. And another thing is disturbance, going into places where bats are roosting, either in the winter when they're hibernating and we cause them to wake up, and that burns through a ton of fat for them. So if you just wake a bat up one time when they're not budgeted for that fat for the winter to wake up an extra time, that can actually cause them to burn through about 30 days worth of fat. So if we had a really long cold winter, you could tell that might be the difference between them surviving or not. And some bats use caves year-round, so there are some species that have their pups and that raise their pups, their babies in the cave. And so going into a cave with bats that may have their pups may actually cause the mothers to abandon their pups, and then those pups will die. Wind energy is another thing that's affecting bats and also birds across the country. While it's really important that we look for sustainable energy sources, we also have to really figure out how we can use science to make sure that we're not impacting our wildlife species. So we actually have been working with the wind industry to determine ways that we can sort of coexist with wildlife and wind energy. So there is some science out there that helps reduce mortality to bats and birds, and it's just up to us to work with the wind industry to help them understand how they can better site their locations and how to run their facilities so that they're not impacting wildlife quite as much. And the big one right now is disease, and this is a disease called white nose syndrome. It's a new disease. It's only been known about since about 2007. I worked with this disease for about 3 years before I moved to a different job, so I know a lot about it, so I'm going to spend a little bit of time. You can see on the right that bat has white fungus growing on its face and ears, and and wings. That's why we called it white nose syndrome, because of the white fungus growing on the face. It turns out, after we've learned more about the disease, that it's actually not the fungus that grows on their face that's causing the problem. And I'll talk a little bit more about that, but maybe we should have named it a little bit better, but we didn't know much about it at the time. And the picture on the left is, sadly, you can see that's a cave, and all those little bat carcasses on the floor there. That's kind of what happens when the disease gets into a cave. So what is white nose syndrome? It's a disease that affects hibernating bats. If you remember a few minutes ago, I was talking about we have some migratory species in the U.S. and we have some hibernating species. This one only affects the hibernating species. It's caused by a cold-loving fungus. The fungus will only grow between about 41 and 57 degrees Fahrenheit. Bats have a body temperature when they're active that's similar to ours, in the upper 90s. But when they go into hibernation, they actually lower that body temperature. If you remember earlier, I said they lower their body temperature and metabolism and things like that. So that actually puts their body temperature right in this range where the fungus likes to grow. The disease has extremely high mortality rates. Unlike most wildlife diseases we've ever seen, some bat species are experiencing over 90% mortality from the disease, and in some caves we're seeing 99 to 100% mortality of the bats that were hibernating in there. The disease is also affecting multiple species of bats. So we've got, like I said before, we have 47 species of bats. 26 of those are hibernating bats. Right now we've got 7 species of bats that are affected by this disease. And I do always like to point out it's really not a threat to humans or pets or livestock, mostly because our body temperatures are just too warm, and also because we don't hibernate. So you guys may have heard a little bit or learned a little bit about the disease triangle in school, so I'm going to just really quickly talk about how this disease is kind of the perfect storm and is killing lots of bats here in the U.S. First, we'll talk a little bit about the pathogen, which is one part of the disease triangle. This disease, as I mentioned, is caused by a fungus called Pseudogymnoascus destructans. We just call it PD a lot of the times to make it easier because it's such a big long name. So PD is a newly described fungal species. We didn't know it even existed before white nose syndrome started happening. As I mentioned, the optimal growth range is between 5 and 14 Celsius, which is 41 to 57 Fahrenheit. It invades the skin tissue of hibernating bats. So if you remember back to that picture a few slides ago, the fungus is only growing on the places where there's skin available. It's not growing on top of their fur. So their wings, their muzzles, their ears, their tail membranes. This is really important because a bat's wing tissue is actually about 80% of the surface area of its body. And so when this fungus attacks the wing tissue, it's actually disrupting a lot of important physiological functions. It's disrupting their ability to stay hydrated. It's disrupting their blood pressure. It's disrupting their ability to maintain their body temperature. So while they're hibernating, their body isn't really having an immune response. It's really being affected by this fungus. We have found PD in other countries and on other bats, but it doesn't seem to be causing the same sort of mortality that it's causing here in the U.S. And that's actually one of the areas that we're focusing on for research, looking at some of the differences between European and Asian bats and U.S. bats to see if we can find some clues as to how we might address this disease. Talk a little bit about the environment. Caves, where bats hibernate. If you look at this map, all those little red dots are cave locations. This is kind of an older map, so you'll see some newer ones. There's lots more yellow on this map, but the yellow blocks are counties where we found white nose syndrome, and you can see it's pretty closely aligned with the caves. The fungus is a cave-loving fungus. And then talk a little bit about this host here. Again, I mentioned there's 7 bat species that are affected by the disease. You can see the 2 at the bottom, Indiana and gray bat. Those are 2 of our federally listed bats. And we're also looking at some of these other bats maybe to protect them under our federal laws to make sure that we can try to help them hang on through this disease. Really quick talk about how it gets spread. Mostly the disease is spread from bat to bat. If you look at the map on the right here, there's a little central dot there in Vermont, and then all these little lines going to where the bats actually went for the summer. The central site is where they hibernate. So you can see that they're going kind of far away from where they're hibernating, and then they're coming back and getting together. So they're intersecting with other bats and spreading the disease. But we also think that people can perhaps move the fungus around. So, you know, we might get it on our boots or on our backpacks if we're in a cave. If we go to another cave and put our backpack down, or a chunk of dirt falls off of our boot, it's possible that we could move the fungus with us. So it's really important for us. You can see the scientists in this picture are wearing some protective gear. We decontaminate all our gear, and we're really careful about trying not to move the fungus from cave to cave. I'm just going to click through these really fast so you can see how the disease is spread. This is the first site that we discovered in the winter, probably over 2005, 2006. And then I'm going to just start clicking through, and you'll start seeing how the disease is spread. So now we are pretty much in half the states in the US and half the Canadian provinces, and the disease is pretty widespread. So it's affecting a lot of bats. And it's pretty much spread halfway across the country in the last 7 years. So we expect that it probably will eventually reach the other side of the country. So what does that mean? What's happening to the hibernating bats? You can see some of these graphs. Of the beginning of those is where the bat population counts were before white nose syndrome hit, and then now you can see at the end there, those populations have really crashed. And if you want to see what that looks like, this is a cluster of bats on the ceiling of a cave in New York. Bats like to hibernate in the same spot. They get a good spot, they come back there the next year, they really want to stay there. It's kind of like you've got your favorite spot on the couch. You like to curl up and watch your movies and play video games and things. So the bats really find their little spot, and you can see what's happened to that cluster of bats over the couple of years. It's really been reduced. And one cave that I visited and have some pictures here, you can see lots of little bones and skulls and things on the floor, which is really sad. It used to have 300,000 bats, and when I visited there in 2010 and took this picture, there were only 35 bats in there. So the disease is really having a heavy impact on bat populations. I'm going to skip over that one because I want to make sure I can get to some of these questions. So what does this mean? Bats are the primary predator of night-flying insects. They eat lots of forest pests and crop pests, things that eat our corn and tomatoes and cucumbers and our trees here in the US. So they've done some estimates and found that it could cost American farmers up to $22 billion a year if we lose all of our bats. Bats are also really important to cave ecosystems. So those bats that do live in caves bring in a lot of nutrients through their guano, which is their poop. It's really important for things like cave crickets and salamanders and things like that. They feed on the guano. You know, the crickets feed on the guano, and then the salamanders feed on the cricket eggs, and it's a whole cycle. So without the bats, we're missing a really important piece. And then other impacts, we're just losing lots of different species. It's already affecting 7 species, so we're worried about what happens if we lose more. So what are we going to do about it? The Fish and Wildlife Service, the agency that I work for, we're leading a cooperative response. So we work with lots and lots of people. We work with state agencies. So whatever state you live in, we work with your state Fish and Wildlife folks. We work with universities, so colleges that are around you we work with. We work with non-government organizations. And mostly we're trying to make sure that everybody is doing the right thing, that we're all decontaminating our gear, that we're learning as much about the disease as we can. We're trying to figure out where the bats are and monitoring their health, trying to figure out when the disease gets there so we can develop a better understanding of the disease and look for ways that we can stop that disease. We're also working to protect and conserve habitat, so things like forests, caves, and even some of those old structures like barns and buildings that bats may be in. We work with some of our other partners to protect bat habitat. And you might wonder what you can do. There's actually lots of things you can do. You can educate yourself and others about bats. You can provide some safe roosting habitat. Lots of people put up bat houses. You can just kind of take notice of bats that might live around you. If you suddenly noticed a barn near you had a lot of bats coming out of it at night, you might want to let your state wildlife agency know. And if you see bats in the middle of winter flying around, that's not a very good thing. They should be hibernating. So if you did see bats flying around in the middle of winter, you might want to report that to your state wildlife agency. If you do explore caves, you should always check and make sure that those caves are open before you go. You don't want to either be disturbing bats or going into a cave that they know has a disease and you could potentially move the fungus. And cave explorers should also decontaminate all their footwear and clothing and gear before they go in between caves. Never touch a bat. Bats do have, you can see in that picture, that's a big brown bat. Those guys are beetle eaters, so they have to have really sharp teeth so that you can crunch through those hard beetle shells. And they can bite you. And if you pick them up, they might bite you because they don't have many defenses against humans. And bats can carry a disease that's called rabies. It's not very common for bats to carry disease, but if you pick up a bat and get bit by it, the only way we can test for rabies is to actually kill that bat. So it's really important not to touch bats. If you see a bat somewhere that it shouldn't be, you want to go and get an adult and let them figure out how to get the bat out of the building or make sure that nobody gets bitten. And also you can teach people to care about bats. Talk to your family, talk to your friends, you know, figure out if there's a place near you that does bat programs, and just learn more and tell people more about bats. So that's the end of my slides. I see I've got a couple questions over here. And just so you guys know, that's a little brown bat that I'm holding there, and I think it's a really cute one. So I'm going to go back and look at some of these questions. And it looks like, all right, Linda asked, what areas should students pick for high school courses interested in wildlife studies? I would say any science courses, biology, ecology, chemistry, those types of courses are going to be really important when you go into college. If you want to go into wildlife management or biology or some sort of science, having a really good base of science courses is really a good idea. And then Ani, fourth graders would like to know, do all bats sleep upside down and why? That's a really great question. Bats do sleep upside down, and the reason is, if we go back, let me see if I can get back to the beginning here, and look at their bat skeleton, because they have to have so much upper body strength and those big muscles to work all those wings, they've had to reduce their, whoops, there it was, reduce their lower body size. So you can see that bat's pelvis in between where its legs connect is really tiny. So they actually don't have very strong legs. So they actually can't stand up like a human or you know, a chimpanzee or something like that. So another really interesting thing about that is that the bat's legs are actually on backwards compared to ours. So their knees actually bend the opposite direction of us. So when they come in and hang upside down, the way that their legs are built actually doesn't require any muscles. When they hang on their feet, it just closes their feet, so they're not actually having to use muscles to hold on. It's also a great way to get away from a lot of predators, and it makes it really easy for them to take off flying. They just open their feet and they're already up in the air, and then they can take off flying. So it's a really neat adaptation, and bats are the only mammals that have it, and I think that's super cool. And then we also had a question about, why is bat poop called guano? I don't actually know the answer to that question. That might be a good one for you guys to look up. I've never heard why it's called guano. But guano is actually a really great fertilizer. A lot of people use guano to fertilize their gardens and things like that. So people actually go pay for bags of bat poop, if you can believe that. Okay, Linda asked, can white nose syndrome affect people? No, it can't, because our body temperatures are too warm for the fungus to grow, we are not susceptible to white nose syndrome. Will white nose syndrome cause extinction? That's possible that we may see some bats species that are what we would call extirpated. So, for example, little brown bats that live all across the United States, they have been really heavily impacted in the Northeast. We may see a regional extinction of those bats, so the population that lives in the Northeast may become extinct. What we hope will happen is we'll learn enough about this disease to interrupt that disease cycle and protect some of those bats, or that some bats, because of their behavior or their roost selection or some other reason, won't be affected in the same way, and we will see some populations surviving. We actually are seeing small populations of bats surviving from the disease. Barbara asked how high a bat house should be. Also a really great question. There are some great online resources, and one place I'll direct you is Bat Conservation International. It's sort of the big bat NGO, non-governmental organization. They have a great page that has tips on how high and which direction to face your bat house, and also some plans on there if you wanted to build your own bat house. Valerie asked, we want to know how to tell if our bat house is being used. Okay, well, Valerie, what you can do is most likely time of year that your bat house would be used would be in the summer. Oftentimes little brown bats and big brown bats will use bat houses for maternity. So they'll actually have their pups in there because it's pretty well protected from predators. So what you can do is either take a really bright flashlight in the day when the bats would be sleeping and kind of shine it up in there and look and see if you can see any bats. Another thing would be to look for their droppings, the guano. Bat guano is about the size of a grain of rice. It's a little bit bigger than bat poop or than mouse poop. And it's sparkly usually because bats eat insects, and insects have those shiny, sparkly shells. If you see little about rice-sized poops that kind of have sparkly look to them, those are probably bat guano, and so you can actually tell if bats are in there if their droppings are there too. Okay, Deb, Miss Perryman's class. This is Megan. Can bats see in color? That's a really good question. I think that bats can see in color, but I am not 100% sure on that. That would be a good thing to look up too. I do know that their eyesight is about equal to humans in terms of how well they can see, but I'm not 100% sure on whether they can see in color. So maybe actually you can look that one up and send an email to me through Miss Perryman and let me know. So, fourth graders want to know, is there a bat reserve in Washington State and where? Also, from our students, is there a place where kids can look at bats? Well, actually, Valerie and your class, I live near Olympia, and there is a great place near here in the summer called Woodard Bay, and it's the largest bat colony in the state of Washington, and they have a maternity colony under a railroad trestle bridge, and if you go there in the evenings, you can see the bats leaving to go out to hunt for the night. So that's the best place that I know of in Washington State, although there may be some others, and you could possibly find that out online. Let's see, another one from Valerie. What sound does a bat make? Well, this is a great question too, and we're on the right slide because we've got the echolocation slide up there. So bats make two kinds of sounds. They make audible sounds, sounds that we can hear in our hearing range. Lots of different squeaks and clicks and things like that. They actually have a pretty complex language structure, and scientists have found different calls that mean different things. But their echolocation calls, the calls that they use for navigating and flying, are actually outside of our hearing range. We can't hear them at all. We can use a little device called a bat detector that will help us bring that sound down into our hearing range. Their echolocation calls sound like a series of clicks or kind of squeaks, and based on what that sound goes out and bounces off a bug and comes back to them, they can increase how fast they're emitting those sounds, how fast they're squeaking. And actually, they have a really fascinating squeak muscle. It's a super fast muscle. It's actually about 100 times faster than the fastest muscles we have, which is our eyelids for us to blink. And they have that's the fastest muscle known in mammals, and that's how they emit those pulses, those squeaks, so that they can hear, find their prey at night. When they get closer and closer, the squeaks get closer together, so they can really tell which direction the insect's flying, how far away it is. They can even actually tell what the texture of that insect is. So if you remember, I said some bats really like beetles and some really like moths. They could actually tell, oh, that doesn't really seem like something I want to eat. I'm going to go ahead and let that one go and find something else. So it's really, really fascinating and cool. Okay, let's see. Looks like a couple people have signed off. And Linda asked if we can show the slideshow to your other classes. You sure can. I'd be happy for you to do that. I think you can download it potentially from Omnovia, and if you can't, if you want to get in touch with Deb, I'm sure we can arrange to get you a copy of that. And we still have a few minutes. Do we have any other questions? Oh, great. It looks like you're recording it, so people will be able to hear it later. All right, third grade, Valerie, third graders asked, do bats have predators? That's an awesome question, and actually they do. Lots of things like to eat bats. Hawks, owls, snakes, raccoons, skunks even. So when the bats are coming out of the cave at night, some bat colonies are really, really huge. Like for example, in Texas, there's a bat colony that's the biggest bat colony in the world. It's not only the biggest bat colony in the world, it's the biggest congregation of mammals in the world. And so when those bats are coming out, there are just thousands and thousands of bats coming out. There are 10 to 20 million bats in this cave, which is an awesome sight to see. And when those bats are coming out, you'll actually see some of the predators hanging out waiting. You'll see hawks swooping down and owls, and sometimes some of the bats will get knocked down to the ground, and then snakes will get them and things like that. So there are some natural predators for bats. Those guys don't get that many of them. Really, probably a bigger threat to bats rather than predators is humans and all the impacts that we have on bats. Okay, Deb, can we volunteer? Any volunteer opportunities for students? That's a really great question. What I would say is you could look into some of the bat organizations that are out there, Bat Conservation International, Organization for Bat Conservation, the Save Lucy campaign, which is one that I work with, and you can actually see if they have volunteer opportunities in your area. You might also check with your local zoos or places like that, if I know some zoos have bat colonies, some don't. You might be able to find an opportunity there. We've actually had a lot of classrooms that have sort of started their own volunteer sort of campaign where they're trying to educate their friends and family and neighbors and communities about bats and why they're important. Deb, I believe you're in Chicago. I'll send you a link later. There's a really great thing about bats in the city in Chicago. That's pretty neat. So no matter where you are, it's likely that there is some kind of organization that's working on bat conservation. Even if it's one of these bigger ones that's more national in scope. They can connect you with folks in your state or your area that may be able to help you find some volunteer opportunities. We've got some great classes that have made great videos about bat conservation, or you know, some classrooms that have made websites and things like that. So there's lots of ways that you can get involved. Sure, Valerie. Valerie asked if they could ask some bat anatomy questions. Oh, good, Deb. I'm glad you guys are enjoying. Okay, Jill is asking, do bats change their coloring during the seasons? They, not that I have noticed, but I have only worked with bats mostly in the eastern part of the US, so I don't want to speak for bats worldwide. There may be some bats that change their fur, their coats in the winter. Their winter fur is pretty similar to their summer fur in terms of color, although I have noticed some bats do molt, so it's possible that they may get some thicker fur in the winter time. Valerie asked, why are bats so small? Well, our bats here in the US are small, mostly because they're insect-eating bats. Excuse me. And because they eat insects, they have, most of our insects are pretty small. The bats are flying to catch small flying insects. So flying takes lots and lots of energy. So you don't want to be really, really big because then you're going to have to eat more and more and more and more insects. So actually those big bats, and if I can go back a little bit to the beginning where we're talking, oh, there it is, the megabats versus the microbats. The megabats are oftentimes the fruit-eating bats. So while they are flying and they're using energy, their prey is not trying to get away from them, right? Their fruit is just sitting on a tree. They go up and they eat some figs or bananas or pomegranates or whatever it is that they're eating, and they don't have to expend all that extra energy flying around trying to catch their prey. So they're able to be bigger. Let's see. Valerie asks, how can we tell the difference between a male and a female bat? Well, just like bats have similar skeletons to us, they're mammals and they have lots of other features that are similar to ours. So the female bats breastfeed their babies, nurse their babies, milk just like humans. So in the summer when female bats have pups, one way scientists can tell if it's a male or a female is to look for their nipples and see if they're lactating, if they have milk. The male bat's genitals, their penis, is visible through their fur, especially during the time of year when bats are mating. So it's not something you could tell probably without a scientist there to show you how to do it. But when we're working with a bat, we can tell if it's a male or a female bat. Valerie asked again, are bats blind? No, they're not. They actually can see pretty well. They can see just about like human beings can see. So that's actually just an old wives' tale that bats are blind. They do actually use their eyesight sometimes, but when they're out at night and they're hunting and it's really dark, their eyesight isn't the best way for them to find their prey and to see and to navigate. So that's when they use that echolocation. So they're actually kind of lucky. They have a sixth sense that we don't have. They have this echolocation ability. So they're able to use sound to create a picture so that they can see in the dark, even though they're not actually using their eyes. Deb asked, what's the biggest bat on record? That would be the Malayan flying fox. These guys are huge. They can have up to 6-foot wingspan, and they're beautiful bats. But even being that big with a 6-foot wingspan, they only weigh about 3 pounds. So they're still pretty light. They have to kind of stay small in size so that they can fly. As I said before, if they get too big and too heavy, it's going to be really difficult to fly, and they're going to be spending too much energy versus their body size, and it's just not going to be efficient. So they're kind of sized based on their prey and what's efficient and possible for flight. Okay, Deb then asked, how can we tell the difference between various species of bats? Are there any obvious signs? Well, it's kind of hard to tell from afar unless they're one of the kind of fancier bats. I showed you the picture earlier of the spotted bat with the big pink curly ears and the black and white polka dot fur. You might be able to pick that guy out if you saw him in a lineup. Not sure where that picture is. But most of our bats in the US are pretty small, and you're not going to really be able to tell from afar. Although there are some ways. You remember before when I was talking about their guano, their poop. So some bats, the bigger bats, have bigger turds, and the smaller bats have smaller turds. So there's two bats in particular that really like hanging around human structures and are often the ones that will use bat houses, and those are big brown and little brown bats. And the big brown bats are noticeably larger than the little brown bats, and so are their poops. So if you had a bat house with multiple size poops in there, you might be able to tell. Another way we can tell is using a bat detector and acoustics. So looking at their echolocation, their calls. We have some call databases. We can load that information from a bat detector into a computer and visually look at what the calls look like, and that can help us determine which kind of bats we're looking at. Deb, can you milk a bat? Well, it sounds like somebody has watched, what's that movie, Meet the Parents. You can actually milk a bat. One thing that we do in the summer when we're trying to figure out if the females are lactating, if they have pups, if they have a baby that they're feeding, is to gently squeeze around the area of the nipple, and a little bit of milk will appear if the bat has a pup that it's feeding. So it's possible, but they're so tiny it wouldn't be, you know, there's no reason to milk a bat. All right, Jill, are bats aggressive towards people ever? That's a really good question. I have not found that they're aggressive towards people unless they're being handled, because they don't really have any defenses. So imagine if you were just walking down the road and a giant hand came out of the sky and grabbed you. You'd be kicking and wiggling and biting and trying to get away. And that's basically what bats do too, is they're afraid of you. You're a big predator to them. You have eyes on the front of your head. You're much larger than them. They're afraid you're going to injure or hurt them or eat them. So they're going to try to get away any way they can. So occasionally that will include trying to bite you. Bats that are sick sometimes do behave a little bit more aggressively. So, you know, again, back to the slide at the end of the presentation, you never want to touch a bat. If you see a bat on the ground, it could be sick. And if you get bitten by a sick bat, you're going to have to go to the doctor and get some shots and things like that. It's not very nice for you or for the bat, because the bat has to be killed in order to test it for disease. So it's a really good idea to never to touch bats. Okay, Deb, we are wondering, if a mother died, could you milk a mother to feed another's pups? That's a good question. There are some bat species that will actually, the females will adopt other pups that have, something has happened to their mothers. So, you know, in the wild, that does happen, where one mother bat may adopt a baby bat that something happened to the mother. This happens a lot with vampire bats, where they'll share food with other bats. But you know, there are some places that rehabilitate bats. So if a baby bat fell out of its roost, there are people that are licensed wildlife rehabilitators. So the state has to actually give them a special license, and they can rehabilitate baby bats. And they feed them with a milk substitute. So they don't actually milk another bat to get milk for that baby, but they use a milk substitute. Valerie, why do bats hang upside down? Well, they hang upside down for a couple of reasons. One reason is because it helps them to be able to take off to fly a lot easier. They don't have very strong legs, and the bottom half of their body doesn't have very many muscles. So they can't really run or take off from the ground very well. So it's a lot easier for them when they're hanging upside down to just drop down and fly away. And it also helps get them out of the way of predators. So they're hanging up high on the ceiling. It's harder for things like a raccoon or a snake to get them because they're up high. How fast do bats fly? Valerie asks. That's also a really great question, and that really depends on which kind of bat we're talking about. But one of the fastest bats that I know of is the Brazilian free-tailed bat. These are the kind of bats that we have in Texas. There's lots and lots of them. They live under this bridge in Texas and Austin. If you wanted to go see bats and you were ever in Austin, Texas, you can go see bats underneath the bridge. And those guys can fly up to 60 miles an hour if they have a good tailwind. So they can fly really, really fast. All right, Deb. If a bat survives white nose, are they immune? That is a really, really great question. Fungus is very different than bacteria or viruses. So if you get a cold or a virus, your body produces antibodies that help protect you from getting that sickness again. So we actually can build immunity to bacterial and viral diseases. But mammals don't build immunity, excuse me, to fungal diseases in the same way. So unfortunately for bats, if they survive 1 year with white nose syndrome and they manage to live through the summer and fall and come back to the cave and get exposed to white nose syndrome again, they can get it again. So that's one of the big challenges for us in trying to figure out how we're going to manage this disease, is that the fungus can live in caves for a really long time. It doesn't actually even need bats to live in the caves. It can just eat decaying soil matter if there are no bats, but when bats do come in there, the fungus will attack them too. So it's really challenging because returning bats or new bats that come to a cave are going to continue to be exposed to the fungus. And I should add, that's one of the questions that we are looking at, is how can we either eliminate the fungus from the environment, or, you know, is there a way that we can help protect the bats from being re-exposed? Is the fungus invasive? Yes, it is invasive. We aren't exactly sure where it's from. We're just learning, as I mentioned on that slide about the fungus, it's a new to science fungus. So we don't even know where it is everywhere yet. We do know it's in lots of European countries. We're starting to do some testing to see where we can find it and see what the natural distribution of the fungus is, where it's supposed to live, versus, you know, it probably accidentally got brought to the US by humans. It's not supposed to be here. It's not part of our system here. Okay, Valerie, our younger students have tons of questions. Can we send you the ones we can't answer for ourselves? Yes, you can certainly do that. I would work with Deb to get maybe get a list of questions to me, and I can try to get those answers back to you. If you wanted to find a good place to look up lots of bat answers, Bat Conservation International's website and Organization for Bat Conservation and Save Lucy campaign all have really great websites with lots of good information for, especially for kids, about bats. Sure. Thanks, Jill. Valerie, where are you guys? Linwood. Okay, I have to admit, I've only been in Washington for about 6 months, so you'd have to tell me where that is. North of Seattle, about 15 minutes. We might be able to work that out. Maybe, Valerie, if you can get with Deb, she can get you my email address, and we can talk. Thanks, Deb. I had a really great time. I'm sad I can't hear everybody. I wish I could hear you guys and hear your questions, but this worked out okay. Awesome, Valerie. I love to hear it. Maybe next year we can plan a field trip to Woodard Bay and see the bats there too. Everybody come to the field trip. I'd love that. Great, great. Thanks, Barbara. All right, well, it looks like we're winding down questions, so I'm going to go ahead and log off, and I know there's some other great sessions coming up, so I hope everybody's tuning in. Bye, guys.